In 2019, studies showed that nearly 1.5 million elderly people were living in nursing homes across the country. But not everyone is willing to accept this fate. For some, the fear of losing control over their life is more terrifying than the thought of growing old. Margaret was one of those people. At 75 years old, she had lived independently for as long as she could remember, and the idea of being sent to a nursing home filled her with dread. Her two sons, David and Paul, believed that moving her into assisted care was the best decision as they struggled to balance their own lives while caring for her. But for Margaret, it felt like they were abandoning her, treating her like she no longer mattered. In her mind, her sons were plotting to take away her freedom, and she wasn't going to let that happen. What began as a simple conversation about the future soon spiraled into a much darker plan. Margaret decided she had only one way out to eliminate the threat. And so she turned to poison, a quiet and deadly solution. This is the tragic story of how a mother's desperation led to an unthinkable crime. Stay with us as we uncover the events that brought Margaret to her breaking point and the consequences that followed, as her fear of a nursing home led to a fatal decision. Margaret had always been a strong woman. At 75 years old, she still managed to live independently in the small home she had lived in for decades. Her days were spent tending to her garden, preparing her own meals, and watching her favorite shows on television. Margaret cherished her independence. It wasn't just a way of life for her, it was her identity. The thought of losing that independence terrified her more than anything. She knew her body wasn't as strong as it once was, but the idea of being sent to a nursing home filled her with dread. Her two sons, David and Paul, were concerned about their mother's health. Both of them had busy lives, and although they loved their mother dearly, they struggled to balance their responsibilities. David had a family of his own, and Paul was deeply involved in his career. They believed it was time for Margaret to move into assisted care. They had seen their mother's health decline over the past year, and the falls she had taken only confirmed their decision. But for Margaret, the idea of a nursing home felt like a betrayal. In her mind, it wasn't just about losing her independence, it was about being discarded by her own sons. What started as a suggestion from David and Paul soon became a point of tension between them and their mother. They tried to convince her that it was for her safety, that she needed help they couldn't always provide. But Margaret saw their concern as something far more sinister. She believed they wanted to get rid of her, to place her in a home where she would be forgotten. Every conversation about the future only deepened her resentment toward her sons. Margaret's fear and anger began to consume her thoughts. She felt trapped, as if her fate had already been decided by her own children. In the quiet moments of her day, she would replay their conversations in her mind, each time becoming more convinced that her sons didn't care about her anymore. She started thinking about what she could do to stop them from sending her away. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that there was only one way to stop the plan. Her mind turned to the idea of poison. It was quiet, it was discreet, and it would ensure that she wouldn't be forced into a nursing home. Margaret began researching poisons, learning about which substances would act quickly and leave little evidence. She knew she had to be careful, to make sure everything went according to plan. The idea of killing her own sons disturbed her at first, but as the days passed, her desperation overshadowed any sense of guilt she might have felt. In her mind, this was the only way to keep control of her life. David and Paul had no idea what their mother was planning. They continued to visit her, still trying to persuade her to consider assisted living, never suspecting that their attempts to help her were pushing her closer to a dark decision. They saw Margaret's resistance to the idea as stubbornness, but for her, it was a fight for her survival. The day Margaret decided to act was like any other. She invited David and Paul over for dinner, telling them that she wanted to have one last discussion about the future. Her sons arrived, unaware that their mother had already made up her mind. Margaret had prepared a meal for them, just as she had done countless times before. But this time, she added something extra to the food, something that would ensure she wouldn't be sent to a nursing home. As they sat down to eat, Margaret watched her sons closely. They ate and talked, still trying to convince her to see reason. She listened, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew that soon, their voices would fall silent. It didn't take long for the effects of the poison to set in. David was the first to notice something was wrong. He felt dizzy, and within minutes, he collapsed. Paul tried to help his brother, but soon he too was overwhelmed by the poison. Margaret remained calm as her sons struggled. She had prepared herself for this moment, and there was no turning back. She watched as both David and Paul's movements slowed, their breaths becoming shallow. It wasn't long before they were both still. When the silence finally came, Margaret sat in the room alone, surrounded by the evidence of her crime. The house that had once been filled with memories of family dinners and laughter was now the scene of a tragedy. Margaret didn't feel relief. Instead, she felt an emptiness that she hadn't expected. She had stopped her sons from sending her away, but the cost had been far greater than she had imagined. It wasn't long before the authorities were called to the house. Neighbors, hearing about the sudden deaths of David and Paul, alerted the police. Officer Benson was the first on the scene. He had seen many crime scenes in his career, but this one was different. The quietness of the home, the stillness of Margaret sitting in the chair was unsettling. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic calls for help. Everything seemed too calm for what had happened. The investigation into the deaths of David and Paul began almost immediately. The coroner's report would later confirm the presence of poison in their systems. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, it became clear that this was no accident. Margaret, once a loving mother, had turned to murder to avoid what she saw as a fate worse than death. And now, the same home she had fought so hard to stay in was the place where her freedom ended. This was just the beginning of the case that would shock everyone who knew the family, a case that would reveal the desperation and fear that had driven a mother to commit the unthinkable. The second part of this tragic story unfolds as the investigation into the deaths of David and Paul deepens. After the shocking discovery of their bodies, the authorities moved quickly. Officer Benson and his team arrived at the house to find Margaret sitting in her chair, silent and emotionless. The quietness in the room was disturbing. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of violence. Everything seemed calm, yet 2 lives had been taken in that very space. The first step was to determine how David and Paul had died. Both men had been in good health, which made their sudden deaths all the more suspicious. The coroner conducted autopsies on the bodies, and it wasn't long before they found the answer: poison. It was clear that this was no accident. Someone had deliberately poisoned the 2 men, and all signs pointed to Margaret. As the investigation continued, the detectives dug deeper into Margaret's life. Friends and neighbors described her as a proud and independent woman, someone who had always prided herself on taking care of her own needs. But in recent years, Margaret had grown more isolated. Her health had started to decline, and she relied more on her sons for support. To outsiders, it seemed like a natural progression, a mother aging and needing her children to help her. But behind closed doors, things were much more complicated. David and Paul had been discussing the possibility of moving Margaret into a nursing home for months. They were worried about her health and safety, and they believed that assisted care was the best option. They had tried to talk to Margaret about it, but every time they brought it up, she shut the conversation down. She refused to even consider the idea, insisting that she could still take care of herself. Her resistance grew stronger with each passing day, and it became a point of tension between her and her sons. The more the detectives learned about the family dynamics, the clearer it became that this tension had reached a breaking point. Margaret had felt cornered, as if her sons were forcing her into a situation she couldn't escape. The fear of losing her independence, of being sent away to a nursing home, consumed her. In her mind, there was only one way out. Margaret's internet search history provided further evidence of her plan. She had spent weeks researching different types of poisons, learning about how they worked, and how to administer them without raising suspicion. Her searches were meticulous, and she had clearly put a great deal of thought into the crime. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. Margaret had planned every detail, from the type of poison she would use to the dinner she would serve her sons. The detectives also found evidence that Margaret had purchased the poison online. She had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks, using an alias and having the package delivered to a nearby address. But despite her efforts to hide her actions, the trail was easy to follow. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and it was becoming clear that Margaret had carefully orchestrated the deaths of her sons. Interviews with Margaret's few remaining friends revealed more about her state of mind leading up to the murders. They described a woman who had become increasingly paranoid and distrustful of her sons. Margaret believed that David and Paul were plotting against her, that they wanted to take away her freedom and lock her away in a nursing home. She saw their attempts to help her as betrayals, and her resentment toward them grew stronger by the day. One friend recounted a conversation she had with Margaret just weeks before the murders. Margaret had mentioned her fear of being sent to a nursing home, saying that she would rather die than live in one. At the time, her friend thought it was just talk and expression of frustration, but now, in hindsight, those words took on a chilling new meaning. Margaret had meant what she said. She truly believed that being sent to a nursing home was a fate worse than death, and she was willing to do anything to avoid it. As the detectives pieced together the timeline of events, they realized that Margaret had been planning the murders for months. The dinner where David and Paul were poisoned was not a spontaneous act. Margaret had invited them over under the guise of having one final discussion about her future. She had prepared the meal herself, making sure to add the poison to their food when they weren't looking. As they sat at the table, unaware of the danger, Margaret remained calm. She listened to their attempts to convince her to move into assisted care, knowing that soon they would no longer be able to pressure her. The poison acted quickly. David was the first to show signs of distress, followed by Paul. Within minutes, both men collapsed. Margaret watched as her son struggled to breathe, but she did nothing to help them. She had already made her decision. In her mind, this was the only way to protect herself from the fate they had planned for her. The detectives knew that the case against Margaret was strong. The evidence of her planning, the poison, and her clear motive all pointed to one conclusion: Margaret had killed her sons to avoid being sent to a nursing home. But as they prepared to charge her with murder, they couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. This was not a typical crime of greed or revenge. It was a tragedy born out of fear, desperation, and a mother's determination to maintain control over her own life. Margaret was arrested and charged with the murders of David and Paul. As she sat in the interrogation room, she showed no emotion. She didn't try to deny what she had done, nor did she express any regret. In her mind, she had done what she needed to do. She had protected herself from the life her sons had planned for her, and now she was at peace with her decision. The case would go on to capture the attention of the media and the public, sparking debates about elder care, independence, and the lengths people will go to in order to protect their freedom. But for Margaret, the story was already over. She had made her choice, and now she would face the consequences. The third part of this tragic crime story focuses on the aftermath of Margaret's arrest. As the news of the double murder spread throughout the town, shockwaves rippled through the community. Margaret, once known as a quiet elderly woman, had now become the central figure in a chilling crime. The idea that a mother could kill her own sons was difficult for many to grasp, but the evidence was undeniable. Margaret had carefully planned and executed the murders, all to avoid being sent to a nursing home. The police began gathering more evidence to ensure that their case against Margaret was airtight. Her computer, which contained searches on poisons and methods of administering them, provided a clear indication of premeditation. Margaret had spent weeks preparing for the murders, and her decision to invite David and Paul over for dinner was a calculated move to put her plan into action. She had wanted the setting to appear normal, a family meal, to avoid raising any suspicion before the poison took effect. The autopsy results confirmed that both David and Paul had been poisoned, with no signs of physical struggle. The poison had acted quickly, leaving the two men defenseless as they collapsed. Investigators were able to trace the poison back to a purchase Margaret had made under a fake name, adding another layer of damning evidence. It was clear that Margaret had gone to great lengths to carry out her plan without raising any alarms. As the police continued their work, the media began covering the case with intensity. Reporters lined up outside Margaret's small home, eager to capture any new developments. Headlines screamed about the mother who killed to avoid a nursing home, and the public was captivated by the story. People debated whether Margaret's actions were driven by desperation, mental illness, or a combination of both. Some sympathized with her fear of losing her independence, while others were horrified by the lengths she went to in order to keep her freedom. Margaret, now in police custody, showed little emotion. She did not deny what she had done, nor did she offer any explanations. In her mind, she had done what was necessary to maintain control over her life. The idea of being sent to a nursing home, losing the ability to care for herself, and becoming dependent on others was something she simply couldn't accept. In her twisted reasoning, ending the lives of her sons was the only way to escape that fate. As Margaret awaited trial, her defense team began preparing for what would be a complex legal battle. They were faced with the difficult task of defending a woman who had meticulously planned and carried out the murders of her own children. The defense considered several options, including the possibility of arguing that Margaret had suffered from severe mental distress, leading her to believe that she had no other choice but to kill her sons. However, the sheer level of planning and the evidence of her methodical actions made it hard to convince anyone that this was a crime born out of temporary insanity. The prosecution, on the other hand, was building a case that emphasized Margaret's cold and calculated nature. They They highlighted how she had not acted in the heat of the moment but had spent weeks preparing for the murders. The prosecutor made it clear that this was not an act of desperation but rather a premeditated crime driven by Margaret's refusal to accept her son's decisions for her future. In the weeks leading up to the trial, more details about Margaret's life began to emerge. Her neighbors described her as someone who had always been fiercely independent, perhaps to a fault. Margaret had prided herself on being able to take care of herself without relying on anyone. Even as she aged and her health declined, she refused to accept help from others, viewing any offer of assistance as an attack on her independence. This stubbornness had only grown stronger over time, eventually leading to the tension between her and her sons. David and Paul, on the other hand, were seen by those who knew them as devoted sons who were simply trying to do what they believed was best for their mother. They had watched Margaret's health decline and had grown increasingly worried about her safety. To them, moving her to an assisted living facility was the most reasonable solution. They wanted to ensure that she was well taken care of and safe, especially after several health scares. But in Margaret's mind, their attempts to help her were nothing more than an effort to strip away her freedom. As the trial approached, the media continued to cover the story with intense interest. The public was eager to see how the case would unfold, and many wondered whether Margaret would show any signs of remorse during the proceedings. Some speculated that her defense would argue that she had acted out of fear and confusion, while others believed that the prosecution's case would focus on her meticulous planning and lack of regret. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal experts, and curious onlookers filled the seats, all eager to witness the outcome of this shocking case. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case, detailing Margaret's search history, the purchase of the poison, and the planning that had gone into the murders. They painted a picture of a woman who was determined to avoid a nursing home at all costs, even if it meant taking the lives of her own children. The defense, meanwhile, tried to shift the focus to Margaret's mental state. They argued that she had been overwhelmed by fear and anxiety, unable to cope with the idea of losing her independence. They brought in psychologists to testify about the impact that aging and the fear of institutionalization can have on a person's mental health. They suggested that Margaret's actions were driven by a deep sense of helplessness, which had clouded her judgment and led her to believe that there was no other way out. As the trial unfolded, the jury listened to both sides with a mixture of shock and sadness. The evidence was clear Margaret had planned and executed the murders, but the question remained what had driven her to such an extreme act. Was she a cold-blooded killer who had taken the lives of her sons to preserve her own freedom, or was she a frightened elderly woman who had made a tragic mistake in the face of overwhelming fear? The third part of this tragic story lays the groundwork for the trial and the emotional toll it took on everyone involved. Margaret's actions had not only ended the lives of her sons but had also left a community grappling with the harsh realities of aging, independence, and the lengths some will go to avoid losing control of their lives. The trial was only the beginning of a long journey toward understanding how a mother's fear could lead to such a devastating crime. The fourth part of the story begins with the trial of Margaret, the elderly mother who had poisoned her two sons, David and Paul, to avoid being sent to a nursing home. The courtroom was filled with spectators eager to hear the details of this shocking case. The atmosphere was tense as friends, family members, and reporters gathered to witness the proceedings. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, her face expressionless, as the prosecution prepared to present its case. The prosecution began with a powerful opening statement. They outlined the events leading up to the tragic deaths of David and Paul. They painted a clear picture of a mother whose fear of losing her independence had turned into a desperate act of murder. They described the tension within the family, detailing how Margaret's refusal to accept help from her sons had ultimately led to this heartbreaking situation. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the crime, highlighting how Margaret had meticulously planned the murders, from her internet searches on poison to the dinner invitation that set the deadly plan in motion. Witness after witness took the stand. Friends and neighbors testified about Margaret's behavior in the months leading up to the murders. They described her as a proud woman, fiercely independent, but increasingly paranoid as her health declined. Many spoke about the growing concern they had for her well-being and the conversations they had with her about assisted living. It became clear that Margaret had felt cornered, convinced that her sons were plotting to take her independence away. Her fear manifested into a sense of betrayal that consumed her thoughts. The forensic evidence was compelling. The coroner confirmed that both David and Paul had died from poison, and the type of poison found in their systems was consistent with Margaret's online searches. The prosecution presented the results of those searches, demonstrating how Margaret had learned about the poison, its effects, and how to use it without detection. The details were chilling, and it became increasingly evident that this was not a crime of passion, but rather one of premeditation. As the prosecution continued to lay out its case, Margaret's defense team prepared to counter the arguments. They argued that Margaret had been driven to this act by her deep fear of losing her independence. They claimed she was overwhelmed and acted out of a state of mental distress. To support this claim, they brought in a psychologist who testified that the fear of institutionalization can lead to irrational behavior. They painted Margaret as a woman who had lost her sense of control, someone who believed that her only option was to eliminate the threat posed by her sons. Margaret's friends shared their concerns about her mental health, discussing how she had become increasingly withdrawn and fearful. They described conversations in which she had expressed her fear of being placed in a nursing home, and how those conversations had become more frantic as time passed. However, the prosecution pointed out that while fear may have influenced Margaret's thoughts, it did not excuse her actions. The evidence clearly showed that she had planned the murders meticulously. As the trial progressed, the jury listened carefully to both sides. The prosecution presented a strong case backed by physical evidence and witness testimonies. The defense tried to evoke sympathy for Margaret, arguing that she was a victim of her own fears. But the jury had to weigh the facts against the emotional pleas. It was a difficult task, as the crime was not just a tragic story of a mother and her sons, but one that revealed the complexities of family dynamics, mental health, and the extreme lengths someone might go to preserve their independence. In the final days of the trial, both the prosecution and defense delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution emphasized that Margaret's actions were deliberate and calculated. They reminded the jury of the evidence, including the poison and the premeditated nature of the crime. They argued that this was not a case of a confused elderly woman, but rather a mother who made a choice to kill her children to save herself. The defense focused on Margaret's state of mind. They argued that she was a woman who had reached her breaking point, overwhelmed by the fear of losing her freedom. They pleaded for the jury to see her as a person trapped by her circumstances, rather than a cold-blooded killer. They highlighted her life story, how she had always been strong and independent, and how the fear of losing that had consumed her. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Margaret sat quietly, her fate now in the hands of the jury. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the judge called for order. The foreperson stood up and announced that the jury found Margaret guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. There was no reaction from Margaret. She remained still, her face betraying no emotion. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, and the reality of what had happened began to sink in for everyone present. Margaret was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, there was a mix of emotions in the courtroom. Some felt relief that justice had been served, while others were left grappling with the tragic outcome of a family torn apart. Margaret's actions had irrevocably changed the lives of those involved, and the story of how fear can drive someone to commit the unimaginable would linger in the minds of all who followed the case. The trial had revealed the heartbreaking truth about the lengths to which a mother would go to maintain her independence. It showed that the desire for control can turn into something dark and destructive. As Margaret faced her new reality behind bars, the community was left to reflect on the complex issues surrounding aging, mental health, and the often fraught relationships between parents and their adult children. This story would serve as a stark reminder of how fear and desperation can lead to tragic consequences. The final part of the story focuses on the aftermath of Margaret's sentencing. Life in prison had become Margaret's new reality, and for the first time in her life, she found herself completely dependent on others. The very thing she had feared the most, losing her independence, had become her existence. The cold, concrete walls of the prison were far worse than anything she had imagined about a nursing home, yet here she was, alone and locked away, far from the life she had desperately tried to hold on to. Margaret's cell was small and sterile, a far cry from the comfort of her own home where she had spent years surrounded by memories of her family. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. She had killed her sons in order to avoid being sent to a place where she believed she would lose control of her life, but in the end, her actions had stripped away everything. There was no one left to visit her, no freedom to move about as she wished, and no future outside the prison walls. Her days were long and repetitive. The routines of prison life were a constant reminder of her isolation. She rarely spoke to anyone, keeping to herself and avoiding contact with the other inmates. Some of the prison staff knew about her case, and although they treated her like any other inmate, there was an unspoken understanding that Margaret was not a typical prisoner. She had not committed her crime for money, revenge, or out of hate. Her crime was born out of fear of aging, fear of losing control, and fear of being abandoned. As the years passed, Margaret's health began to decline. The stress of prison life, combined with her advancing age, took its toll on her body. She developed chronic ailments that required medical attention, and the irony of being forced to rely on the prison medical staff was not lost on her. She had once been so desperate to maintain her independence, and now she had no choice but to accept help from the very people who controlled every aspect of her life. It was a bitter reality that she struggled to come to terms with. Outside the prison, the story of Margaret's crime had faded from the headlines. The public had moved on to the next tragedy, the next shocking story. But for those who had known David and Paul, the pain of their loss remained. Friends and extended family members were left to grapple with the aftermath of the murders, questioning how things had gone so wrong. Many could not understand how a mother could kill her own children, regardless of the circumstances. The community was left with lingering questions about mental health, elder care, and how families could reach such a breaking point. The trial had brought to light the complexities of Margaret's mental state, but it had not offered any clear answers. There had been no resolution, no moment of closure for anyone involved. Margaret's actions had left a void that could never be filled, and the story served as a grim reminder of how fear and desperation can push people to commit unthinkable acts. Margaret spent the rest of her days in prison, a shadow of the woman she had once been. The strong, independent person she had prided herself on being was long gone, replaced by a frail and broken woman. Her health continued to deteriorate, and eventually she became too weak to care for herself. She was moved to the prison infirmary, where she spent her final days under the care of nurses and doctors, people she had once feared becoming dependent on. In the end, Margaret's story was one of tragedy. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting fear and pride take over. Her refusal to accept help, her inability to trust her son's intentions, and her overwhelming fear of losing her independence had led her down a path of destruction. She had believed that by taking control of the situation she could avoid the fate she dreaded, but in trying to maintain her freedom, she had lost everything. As Margaret lay in the infirmary during her final days, her mind drifted back to the life she once had. She thought of David and Paul, of the family meals they had shared, and of the love they had shown her throughout the years. She wondered if things could have turned out differently if she had only trusted them, if she had only accepted their help. But it was too late now. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. Margaret died quietly in her sleep, alone in a place where she had once feared ending up. There was no funeral, no gathering of family or friends to mourn her passing. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were sent to a distant relative who had no real connection to her. In the end, Margaret's life ended much like her son's, in silence, with no one by her side. The story of Margaret's crime would live on as a reminder of how quickly fear can turn into something dangerous. It was a story about a mother who loved her independence so much that she was willing to kill to keep it, only to find herself in a place where she had none. It was a story that left behind a trail of broken hearts and unanswered questions, a story that would be remembered by those who had followed it with a mixture of shock and sadness. The final chapter of Margaret's life was one of solitude and regret. Her actions had taken everything from her, and in the end, she was left with nothing but the memories of what once was. It was a tragic ending to a story that began with a simple fear of aging and spiraled into something much darker.